So like JP said, I'm Trevor Landau. I work at the New York Times doing mainly JavaScript. I think like most of us here. Well, you mentioned the server side, but maybe it's JavaScript. And I work on the mobile team. I worked on the mobile site, and we're on a new app now. So a little bit about this talk. Did that animate, by the way?
Yes.
Didn't do it on my screen. Okay. It's important. So a little bit about this talk. It was actually really hard to figure out what it was going to do. I did the description, but to actually figure out what I was going to talk about was pretty difficult because some libraries do a lot of things. Like Angular has tons of stuff, Ember has tons of stuff, and fit that on the slides was not easy, so I didn't do that. But there are some pieces from some libraries, which you'll hear about in a moment, that you'll find in here. But the important part about this was that I actually learned some new things just by creating a talk about it. And you can do the same thing, but in the intent to learn how to use the library better, and you can figure out maybe some performance things that are under the hood from it, and etc., or how to make your own library. So what I'm actually going to be talking about is, or what I'm going to be doing through this talk is making a library of myself and implementing some of these practices from there. And while those don't always make sense for this use case, it's there for the sake of the talk. So there's going to be a lot of code, and I'm going to step through it, and if there's something you don't understand, it's mostly plain JavaScript. If you don't understand something, just let me know, and it's probably quick to explain. Again, it was difficult to decide what libraries to choose from. I just went with Jquery, common one, and that's mentioned in the description. Backbone, underscore, because they're smaller and easy to pick out from. There's a snippet from Angular, and should.js and Mocha. And if you're unfamiliar with any of those, I'll go over them again. So this is my base library here. It's just a collection. And it's an array-like object that we're going to use. And I say it's array-like because it has things that you can do that are like an array, but it's not an array. So let's get into this. First, we'll go over Jquery. I'm sure we all know what that is. DOM manipulation library, and has some other tools built into it that don't really make sense, but they did at the time when they were implemented. My library doesn't do anything with the DOM, though it could actually, but there's not any DOM usage here. So I don't know if Jquery was the first one to use no conflict, but it was really important for usage when people were putting in different versions of Jquery into their websites because they were blasting away old versions of Jquery. And that was a really big problem because it would break code on deprecated methods, etc. So it's a pretty simple idea. We make a reference to the old library that was set on the window object at this point. And from there, we can call a no conflict method on a local variable. And that way, it gets reset back to where it was. We don't have to worry about blowing it away. So if we log these two methods, we'll get an object and a string because I had set it to foo. But we can kind of get away with this by using a common JS style modules anyway. Sorry. Next is length. This is, if you actually look at the Jquery source, you'll see a length property, and it's just defaulted to 0. And by using array methods with context on this, we can actually just let the array increment the size of our collection as it goes. So if you're unfamiliar with the call syntax or apply syntax, let me know, and I'll go over it really quickly because I use it a lot, since we're dealing with a collection, which usually means there's a lot of parameters going through. So simply do array.prototype.push.call with the context of our collection, and we use push just as we normally would since we're using call here, and we can verify that the length is in fact 2. This is a big one in Jquery. You realize you can pass a string of HTML to it. You can actually pass a regular DOM element. You can pass a function for DOM ready. A lot of things. It's kind of squished to fit in here, but for this case, I'm allowing the collection to accept any number of arguments, whether it's an array, it's array-like. In this case, we're assuming there's a toArray method. for that, so if we look at the use cases down below, pass in the array with 1, 2, 3, or comma separated. And lastly, we have an object just with a to array that returns an array. Obviously, we could probably pass a collection directly into this and automatically put that inside this collection as well. Sorry. So, and we can even expand on this to accept any number of arguments we want. The logic just has to be there. Yes?
At this point, would you ever consider also checking if you are a collection type and recalling yourself with new? That was I remember like 4 or 5 years ago, that was a big how to save people from calling
from
new
the
and
new.
who don't call new.
I'm particularly not a fan of that. I think if you're going to use new, you should be responsible. Yes. Yes. There is hinting in this, if you look at the source. Cool, so let's move past jQuery, and we'll move into Backbone. So a little bit of Backbone learning here for people who don't know about it, but mostly it's about some pretty unique, well, not unique, all of them, functions that are inside of it. So we're going to ignore some of the stuff that is built for like building MVC mostly, but you could use this for part of your collection part. So inside Backbone, if you've never used it before, collections get a ton of methods off of underscores, collection methods. But they make it easier by, instead of having to call your collection directly on an underscore method, by automatically putting the method into it or calling it with the context of the class you're in. So this is ECMAScript 5 method on object for get property names, which is the only way to actually get methods off arrays. But we don't care about all the methods. We don't want to blast away length. We don't care about constructor or the two strings. So simply we're going to iterate over the functions, or the function names, skip them if they're inside our array, and then add a new function which simply calls our array function with the context of our class. So that way it will act like, as we saw before, with length will get updated. In this case, it's always going to return a new array, but we could obviously modify this to make it return a collection as well. We can validate this by making use of this inside of our constructor and do push on there instead of using the array prototype directly. So we can check the length on the constructor time, and then we can call unshift to put a value at the beginning of our collection. You can trust me that it does in fact do that. On and trigger, which are what we kind of hit on before, are events that are built into it. And we can actually see what happens when any of our events are occurring. So the basics are, we're going to do on the collection, when push occurs, some function is going to be called that we provide. And when we call push with our parameters, it's going to call that function. This is not possible without object.observe, some sort of data binding, unless you did a set timeout. But this is obviously much cleaner than set timeout, which would be a pain to manage. This is the only way you will know when properties are changing at all. And so here's the implementation of on. First of all, we need a way to store the methods, or the function event name, sorry. So we'll just make sure one exists or not. If it doesn't, we'll set it as an empty hash, or object. And then we'll actually create an array that will store each of these events that we're going to push onto it. And then we're going to add the listener. This is how we're going to add the listeners. Next, we have trigger. This is how we actually fire set events. We're going to make sure that these events exist first, otherwise there's no point in doing the rest of the function. If you're unfamiliar with slice, it's just a reference to array prototype slice, which will convert an array-like object, such as arguments, into a regular array. But by providing the value 1, we're going to shift off the name, because we don't care about that when we're actually calling the event. So we'll use that name to actually retrieve the events that are set for, or that are inside the events. And we're going to iterate over them and call all the events that are bound onto that. So let's see it in the API. So this is the same function we saw before of creating all the push, unshift, etc. array prototype methods. And all we have to do is say this.trigger with the function name, and the return value that was back from that is how I implemented it. One line just to get that information. To-JSON, or to-JSON, however you want to say it, is actually an interesting implementation. It's part of the spec of JSON. And basically what it does is it allows you to return what you would want JSON stringify to actually output. So without that, if you look near the end, the comment where it says without method, if we didn't have that to-JSON function on our prototype, it would actually output 0th spot has 1, and 1 has 2, and 2 and 3, etc. But with to-JSON, we can actually give an array representation, which is what we really want to see.
Wait, I'm sorry, what? Like, my understanding is that you'd want to return something that looks like JSON, but why would you?
Well, it is going to be JSON, but because I have my own object defined here, and I'm making it act like an array, it's actually just storing the 0th index and whatnot in an associative manner. So as you notice, they're actually strings, like 0 string. But when we use it on array prototype, it's actually going to hit each of those through indexes. But if you run JSON stringify, it's going to run it normally, and therefore it's just going to output all of those. And we'll actually get any other properties around there too, like length, and we don't care about those. So we want to iterate over it as if it was an array, and so that way it's only going to do the indexes, and it'll return the values only. So it'll look like an array, and when JSON stringify gets that array, it's going to stringify that array instead. This is pretty handy since your server wants to see that, not the object style. So I only picked one from underscore, though I do suggest to look at underscore pretty deeply. It's highly functional, and it's a really good learning experience from there. But one bit I really enjoyed about this, so this is basically reimplementation of zip, which allows you to take multiple arrays and put the same indexes inside of a new array for each index that they are set in. So the cool part is using map and other methods together. So the second line lengths and the third line length is where the interesting part is. We take our objects, in this case we're going to pass it an arbitrary number of collections. We're going to map back to that a new array of lengths. So it could be 2, 3, 4 are going to be an array. Then we're going to go to apply math.max on this with each of these lengths, so we can get the maximum length. And so when we actually need to zip these together, we can already have a pre-allocated array to fit this in here, so we don't get any resizing performance issues. Now here's one I actually could pick out from Angular. That's, say again?
Show us the rest of the example.
That is the rest of the example.
How is that? I'm confused by the.
Sure.
So you're counting on, in the for loop, you're counting on I being in the function scope. It's that second to last, it's the last map that I'm confused by.
Oh, sorry, I wasn't trying to talk too much about that, but I can go into it. So the last map is the zipping part.
Yeah.
This is a synchronous process. The map function's right above it. So it's going to go over each index of each of the.
Okay.
You see now? So it's going to go over each index of each of those arrays and return the value. So it'll hit 0th spot in each of those arrays. That's where the map occurs. Yeah. And that's going to return a new array and put that in the 0th spot of our new array that has been pre-allocated.
Yeah, I see it now.
Sorry, I can go over that again. The cool part is, the idea is you want to use like map and other things in tandem, just for single values purposes. So here's one pretty cool thing in Angular that I found out. There's a lot of cool things, but not many of them fit into this slide or are easily transferable into another library. But I didn't know it. I didn't know this at all. There's actually a huge performance hit when you use apply on functions. So this JS perf, which you can go to afterwards, shows that when you use up to 10 arguments instead of using apply on each of those, it actually has almost 10 million operations per second, as opposed to 6 million operations per second. So it's a huge difference, especially if you have a large data set and say you want to create a new collection for each of these, like 10 million spots. So there's 10 arguments per collection and there's 10 million of those. So this is a huge performance win because it's going to take a long time to initialize all of that. And since tons of people are going to be using this API, we definitely want it to be performant. So this is basically an action. We're going to use our performant apply instead, which is going to take the arguments as it did before. It's going to be on the push method, and it's going to be called with this. So to look back at that, we can see that args is the first argument to go into this, the function that we want to call on, and the context of what it's going to be. Now, there might need to be another version of this if you just wanted to call it without context, but for the sake of this API, it's built that way. So Mocha is a testing framework for JavaScript, server-side, client-side, whichever. If you haven't heard of it, you should definitely use it. It's fantastic. And I just learned this a couple days ago as well. JSON stringify actually takes more than one argument. You can pass it a replacer function, which is the second argument, and then there's a third argument that allows you to actually add spaces and format it. So repr, or representation, is something from Python where you can easily just pass out show values that are inside your object or whatever, what have you. So in this case, I had to overwrite to JSON so it doesn't use that stringified version. And the replacer is kind of like an iterator where it gets a key and a value, and you can check the value inside of that and return it. And that will be inside the JSON that you actually want to see. So, excuse me. The reason there's that weird bit self equals val is because the very first iteration, the value is the same as the object. And you have to return that, otherwise it's going to return undefined. And the void 0 is just an alias for undefined as well, but it's safe because it can't be overridden. And after the iteration is over, we're going to delete the instance to JSON, which will set the to JSON to work back to normal. That was really like the only cool thing in Mocha. Everything else was really testing specific. To stay inside testing, we have should.js, which is an assertion library. It uses ECMAScript 5 descriptors, getters, and setters. If you haven't used those before, this is a fantastic library because that's all it uses. And it even puts it on object.prototype, which people might scream at you about. So first we'll do get. It kind of looks funny in comparison to how you've probably regularly been writing your JavaScript. So ignore the params, it's just the syntax that follows. But those don't actually take anything. So these are accessible via collection.size. So why would you want to do this? In the case of the size, it's just an alias. And this .length could not be bound to as a property. It would just be a reference because it's a primitive. So this way, size will always reference what this .length actually is. And maybe we want a faster way to get the JSON stringified version without having to call JSON.stringify every time. So instead, we can just have collection.json, and that will return a stringified version. And my favorite parts are define property, which that text looks kind of funny. We're going to look at this familiar function again now, or it should be familiar anyway. Instead of setting it directly on the prototype using equals function, we're actually going to set it with value, as you can see, inside the define property line. And the value is just the same thing as you would set if it was equal. And then we do the exact same thing that we were doing before. And there's other parameters such as enumerability. And if that's omitted, it's automatically set to false. And then when we do for loops or for of loops, it will actually be ignored. So that's exactly how get own property names works too. Those properties are ignored because JavaScript regularly sets them like that as well. And there's also writable, so now these functions are protected. They cannot be overwritten by someone else who's doing something irresponsible. And there's also configurable, which means they can't be deleted. And by default, those are all false. So this, all the methods on the prototype are officially safe. Oops. So we can actually look at the whole source here. This is the URL, just /Landau, learning from libraries. Probably could have made that shorter. But we can actually see that inside I've got my apply function, as I mentioned before. We have our collection working as it did before. And we have all of our stuff on our prototype. If there's anything that anyone wants to go over again, I'm happy to look at it. And here we actually have defined properties more thought out, so we can go see the other actions there. So we have our value initially set to 0, as we saw, but it was before it was just set directly on the prototype. So this is using defined property. So we can actually say that it's writable, and it is in fact enumerable. And the rest are just some helpers and what we discussed. But inside here again, we can say, let's use defined property to make sure things are not overwritable. And we want the events object to definitely be safe. Don't think there's anything too extra special in here without, you just need to look over it. Yep. And that's it. Questions?